looks like we've got a good bit of the folks who registered. So I think we are good to go ahead and get started. My name is Kate Moore. I'm the Assistant Site Manager at the President James K. Polk State Historic Site. We're located in Pineville, North Carolina. My dog Olivia insists on joining this presentation today as well. I am working from home today, but the site is open right now. We're open Tuesday through Saturday, 9 to 5. We have tours on Saturdays. You can pre-register for those through our website. So feel free to come and visit us. I am going to pass it over to Mr. Luker here without further ado. And if you guys have any questions about the site or about the program today, you can just put those in the chat, and I'll keep an eye out here as we get started.
Well, good morning. My name is Jason Luker. I'm with the Gaston County Museum. I'm its director. And today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite people that I've been able to study while working here in North Carolina has been Ella May. For those who don't know, this is Ella May. It's an early picture of her, one of the earliest we think of her. She was born in September 17th, 1900 to James May and Catherine Mabel May. We know that she had at least one brother, Wesley May, because he kind of shows up later in her life. But that's about it. We don't know what other siblings they may have had. We've tried to do some research to try to find James and Catherine. There are some James May that show up in Tennessee, but we haven't been able to directly connect them to the family. They've been very, very elusive, which is kind of interesting for the fact that they kind of dodged census records for so long. We know from family history that they worked on a farm. They had a family farm during Ella May's early childhood, but by her teens or tweens, really, she's already working in the logging industry, Tennessee logging, with her father being a logger and her mother being a laundress, working with washing the clothes of the workers. Not really sure how they went from the farm to logging, but that was very typical to be seen in the area. We do see her kind of popping up in counties both in North Carolina and South Carolina. So around in that area, kind of what I call the Great Smoky Mountain Range, that is where she is, we believe. She gets married early in life on October of 1916, October the 29th, 1916. She marries John Wiggins. This is the only picture we know of John. You can see him circled. He was in the area. They married in Swain County, North Carolina, probably Bryson City or around that area. She was 17 years old. He was 24 when they got married. So they were both working in the logging business, we believe, and their families had gotten together. This is a turning point for Ella, because in 1918, her mother has passed away. And about a couple of years later, her father tragically dies in a logging accident. A tree crushed him, fell the wrong direction and crushed him. And also, the legend is that John himself got hurt during the logging time. So this was a very dangerous job, but it was also a very devastating job, especially for Ella and her family. When you're speaking of family, Ella was growing one pretty rapidly. These are the kids that we know about or know their names. Lula Lee was John's daughter that came with John. John was a widower. So when he came along, he had already had a daughter that we know of that was part of the family. But quickly, they began having their own children. First coming was Myrtle, which was born in March of 1918 in Bryson City. Then we have Clyde, then we got Millie, then you got Guy, then you got Albert, and then you got Ella Charlotte. It's interesting to be able to use the birth of the children because it kind of shows us the direction the family is going when they actually show up in Gastonia. But we also have records of other children being born. There's supposedly 3 other children that were born and died young. And we don't know their names. We haven't been able to figure them out. I've talked to some of the descendants of the other children, and they do not know the names. One, they believe maybe on one set were twins. There was maybe another daughter named Thelma, but they all died between, I believe, about a month or 2 months of their births. And when you're speaking of passings, this is kind of a theme for a lot of the folks in the area that were moving around, growing large families, but many of them were passing away as well. As for Ella, she and John continued to move around. They got out of the logging business, and the next job that we see them doing is cotton picking in Spartanburg, South Carolina. But soon after that, they began to work in textile mills. And it appears that John is not working most of the time. He seems to be either he's injured or he just doesn't want to work, or somewhere in between. And Ella is the one who is providing a lot of the labor and a lot of the income for the family. And moving into the textile mills was a more stable environment than the logging or even cotton production. That's one of the biggest draws for the early textile mills in our area, was this belief that you're going to have a stable working environment. The owners will provide you homes, the mills provided your homes and necessities in life. It was also a big one of the early draws, especially here in Gaston, they would use is the promise of a better future for your family, for your growing family. So you can easily see how people who've been struggling, who have lost family members, who have actually been injured, have been doing very hard manual labor, being drawn to something like the textile mills, have made these great promises for a future for themselves and for their children. Now, the king of the mills in Gaston County is this one, Loray Mill, also known as Manville Jinks. This mill is the largest by far in Gaston County, one of the largest textile mills ever built in North Carolina. At one point in time, it was the largest single-story structure for textile mills. It was 600,000 square feet structure that had over 170,000 spindles spinning at one time, and close to 17 to 2,000 employees working inside this mill. It was a monster. And this is only one out of 90 mills that were in Gaston County. Gaston County is kind of the heart of the textile industry for both of the Carolinas and pretty much for the entire Southeast. This is the big one. Now, with it being so large, and here's a picture of it inside, kind of give you an idea how large this building is. Being so large, it had a very high, overhead. And the management started to notice that by the 1920s that production had slowed, or the demand had slowed, due to there's no longer, World War I to, make stuff for. So they started to look at new ways to kind of cut costs and to trim the budget. And of course, if anyone's had to deal with budgeting in their lives, they always know the biggest line item on your budget is people. So they went into this new system called stretch out, which was basically they would fire a big chunk of their employees, make the rest of the employees continue to do not only the job they originally were doing, but also the job of those that they fired. They also cut the pay of a lot of their employees. Some employees had pay cuts all the way up to 20%. And they installed a new system of keeping up with the output of their workers. They would start counting their repetitions of labor, their production rate, the PR, while they were working every hour. This is a big change for textile mills. A lot of textile mills, you have a quota, but you would be able to work on it throughout the day, maybe even leave the building or come back. But as long as you met your quota, you're okay. Well, this pretty much system just tied you to your machines and made you work nonstop. It was what was called the device that they used was a thing called a Hank clock, which looks like a speedometer from an old car, and it would be on the machine, just constantly counting repetitions. And the supervisors and floor managers would be able to walk by your machines, see what your production rate is in real time, and then tell you to speed up as you go. This form of working was already prevalent in the North. And it has kind of moved south with the workers. And it's an interesting one for Manville Jinks, for Loray, is one of the a mill that was actually run out of Rhode Island. That's where the management was located. They had management here as well, but it was very much a detached system. And it led for a lot of decisions that look great on paper. I mean, they saved millions of dollars by doing this, and everyone wrote, I was like, hey, this is great. But what was happening here in the mills was it was putting a ton of strain on the workers and making them extremely upset. We were seeing multiple protests kind of pop up, especially in Loray, but other mills who started copying what Loray was doing or doing about the same thing. And it was just producing a lot of strain on the workers, which kind of brings us to the strike. On April the 1st, 1929, almost the entire workforce at Loray walked out. And this is a picture of the workers in front of mill. This was organized by a union that had come down, the NTW, the National Textile Workers Union. They had come down to try to unionize the textile mills in the South. And they saw Loray as a perfect opportunity. One, it was the biggest mill in the South, and it's kind of the idea is if you want to unionize the textile mills in the South, you've got to get into Loray. So they were targeting Loray for that purpose. Also, you had a very upset workforce. There were plenty of people to pull from, and organization was thought to be a easier task. So when they sent down the union reps, they immediately started to scope out Loray, and then in April the 1st, were able to lead this protest, this walkout, and shut the mill down. Their demands were pretty simple in our thoughts today. They were asking for a 40-hour work week with overtime compensation, equal pay for equal work, better working conditions, better living conditions, and representation in the management. The better working conditions, better living conditions, that was an on-standing problem. There was favoritism that was shown if the workers, you had nice houses in the mill village, and you also had shacks in the mill village. And it was, if your bosses liked you, got the nice houses. Bosses didn't like you, you lived in a shack. And the working conditions were just really hard on the employees. It was a dangerous job, and it was becoming even more dangerous because of the amount of work they're having to do. So when they presented these things to the management, manager pretty much said, well, if we do these things, we basically have to give you the keys to the mill. So you can immediately see there's a complete standoff and a fight has begun. One of the big concerns in the management and mill bosses in Gaston County was this not just being a Loray problem, this being all the mill problem, that this could spread. And one of the areas that was looking at being spread to was American Mill number 2. This is a more modern picture of the mill. It's still standing. This is the mill that Ella May was working at. Now, her family had moved around at different mills, had traveled to different places. By the time we find Ella here in Bessemer City, she is by herself. John has left her, and she is with her and her remaining surviving children. One of the more striking things that we were looking at with her is what brought her to the area. And we really don't know, but we do know that she is by herself by the time she hits this mill. And this mill is a very interesting one here in Gaston County. It's one of the smaller ones comparative to, say, Loray. This would easily fit on the first floor of Loray. But it's a fascinating one. It's run by a family called the Goldbergs, who were Latvian Jewish immigrants. They were first settled in Atlanta and then moved up to the Carolinas to begin working in the mill world. And what they would do is they would take struggling mills, much like American Mill number 2, buy it, and then shrewdly put in management styles that would make it a success. And it's been interesting reading about the Goldbergs because a lot of times when you start reading about it in the early years, there's a lot of anti-Semitic overtones to it. And I found it very interesting because the Goldbergs were surprisingly, with the persecutions that they faced, successful. In fact, they're one of the most successful mill running families in Gaston County's history. If any of you have lived in the area for a very long time or from the Carolinas, you may remember pyramid ornaments, Christmas ornaments. That's from the Goldberg family. That came from this mill. The same mill that where Ella May had worked was the same mill that ultimately started making Christmas ornaments made by a Jewish immigrant family in Gaston County, which is just fascinating little bits of history. But when Ella got here, she was working in this mill, and what also was fascinating about the mill was about 40% of its 40% of its workforce was African American. This is a very much different from the rest of the mills in the area. If there was any African American workers, they were not in the main building. They were usually on the outside of the building, and it's still an extremely small workforce. That was documented. So there was a larger workforce, but it was almost like day labor work that was kept off the books to a certain extent. But the Goldbergs actually had, this diverse staff of employees working inside the mill. We don't believe that necessarily that was equal by any stretch of the imagination. It was segregated just like the rest of the South, but it does kind of stand out because there are a lot more intertwined relationships that starting to appear, and where people started working closer to one another, much like Ella with her fellow African American workers. As for Ella, she is starting to see the union as an opportunity. This is a great quote from her that was recorded after her passing, where it talks about her experiences in the mill, where she couldn't take care of her children because she wanted. She was on the day shift and couldn't, or she was trying to get to the day shift, and so she could take care of her kids at night. And the workers would not, the bosses would not allow her. The supervisors wouldn't allow her. So ultimately, she had to quit, and this led to the passing of her children. We do know that 4 of the children did die. Most of them we've seen that were died in child or early years. One of the children we do know a little bit about their passing is Guy. Guy Wiggins died. He was 1 year old. And when he passed away, we've seen his death certificate, and basically he dies of malnutrition. He had a lack of vitamins. And this is a statement, I think, for a look into Ella's life and what she was saying, that she wasn't able to take care of her kids. And that was and that she lived that, especially through Guy. Once Guy dies right before they moved to Bessemer City, and this had a profound effect on her, and that what she was doing in her joining the union was to make a better life for her kids. And it's interesting because, as I mentioned earlier, that was the promise that was made to people coming to the textile mills: a better life for your kids, better life for you, but a better life for them too, a house, a home. And these things were not happening. What they were promised was not coming true. Ella was living in a shack, missing a wall, and her children were starving to death. And this made her reach out to an organization that she felt had her best interest, or her best hope of seeing her life change. So what did Ella do? Ella was an organizer with the Bessemer City Union. That's most of where her work took place was actually in Bessemer City. She was a secretary, it seems, for Bessemer City Union as well. She could read or write, so there's some point in her life she got some education and was able to provide that. She was also a speaker at union rallies, and what's the most famous thing that she's known about is being a singer, that balladeer. And there's some really neat quotes that came out about Ella. I would just want to kind of share to kind of explain her sound. Sadly enough, some of her songs have survived, but none of them survived. There's no recordings as of yet we can find that actually captured Ella's singing. But a couple people did write about it. One in particular, Margaret Larkin, the quote I showed earlier, she wrote, "Her full throaty voice gave the songs in a mountain style, with an odd sort of yip at the end of each line that delighted her audience." Another one was actually from Fred Beal. "No evening passed without getting a new song from our Ella May, the minstrel of our strike. She would stand somewhere in a corner, chewing tobacco or snuff, fumbling over notes of a new poem scribbled on the back of a union leaflet. Suddenly, someone would call for her to sing, and other voices would take up the suggestion. Then, in a deep, resonant voice, she would give us a simple ballad." And my personal favorite came from one of the other strike organizers, along with Fred, a woman by the name of Vera Bush. She wrote a book later in life called Radical Life. And she said this about Ella. She would write little ballads about the strike, set them to some well-known ballad tune, and sing them from the platform in a rich alto voice. Her rather gaunt face would light up and soften as she sang. Her hazel eyes would shine. She became, for a moment, beautiful. And that was a reoccurring thing we see with Ella, that she would sing in a rap singing way, and also the words that she used. As Vera talked about, she would take popular songs or known tunes and then write her own lyrics for them. Her most famous song is Mill Mother's Lament, and probably a lot of you have heard that song. And that is actually the tune from an earlier song about Mary Fagan, who was a little girl who was murdered. She was 14 years old and murdered in Atlanta at a pencil factory. The Leo Frank case is a tragic story and a very interesting one to read into. We won't go into it today. But she took that song and then she added in her lyrics. And I thought instead of really doing that one, because a lot of people know that particular song, there's this little nice little book called Let's Stand Together, the story of Ella May Wiggins, which was produced around the time when her tombstone was put in her grave. And one of the songs they have listed is one that's called The Big Fat Boss and the Workers. Now, I thought I'd read this to you so you can kind of get the style of an Ella May song. The bossman wants our labor and money to pack away. The workers want a union and an 8-hour day. The bossman hates the workers. The workers hates the boss. The bossman rides in a big fine car. The workers has to walk. The bossman sleeps in a big fine bed and dreams his silver and gold. The worker sleeps in old straw bed and shivers from the cold. Fred Bill, he is in prison, asleeping on the floor. But he will soon be free again. Speak to us some more. The union is a growing. The ILD is strong. We're going to show the bosses that we have starved too long. Catchy, and it gets to the heart of what a lot of the workers were experiencing. She was able to take, complex thoughts or arguments and put them in a way that was both entertaining and also get the point across. And the union, representatives definitely recognized how important this was and how effective Ella was in reaching out to the community and rallying support. And it was something that they wanted to even more capitalize on. So they sent her off with a troop to Washington, D.C. This was done in May of 1929. And this delegation was going up to talk to the National Women's Trade Union League and also to speak with the Senator Committee on Manufacturing, basically trying to talk about the plight of the working class in the textile mills and the desire to see them unionize. If you can't find Ella in this picture, she's the one wearing I'm from the South, so it's called a toboggan, and right there in front. And I always find it very fascinating when that picture was taken. She's 29 years old. That does not look like a 29-year-old to me, but she is, as we've spoken, her life has been a difficult one. Well, when they get up to DC, they try to do these speaking engagements they did with very little result. They were kind of shut down at times and just were, not much was really being beneficial from this trip. So they're kind of, hanging out and kind of lollygagging around the Capitol. And so happened a senator from North Carolina, I'm trying to find his name, yes, Lee Slater Overman, who is a junior senator for North Carolina, was giving a tour to a group of girls from Greensboro and was walking through the area, and they spotted him and immediately went up to go talk to him about their plight, kind of cornered the guy. Apparently he saw them try to get away and they wouldn't let him, so he's pretty much trapped. And they keep on talking to him and basically getting in an argument. And at one point in time, the great senator notices one of the strikers was a young girl named Benny Green. We believe this is a picture of her The young little girl in the picture is Benny. And he says to her flippantly that she needs to be in school. At that point, Ella laid into the man. He stated, "How can I send my children to school when I can't make enough to clothe them decently? When I go to the mill at night, I have to lock them up at night by themselves. I do not have anyone to look after them. Last winter, when two of them were sick with the flu, I had to leave them at home in bed when I went to work. I can't get them enough good clothes to send them to Sunday school." That's the senator excused himself, and much to the shock and horror of the Greensboro girls, they kind of scurried away. Granted, this got picked up by the local reporters and became some news and gave even more celebrity status to Ella May, who had just chewed out a senator in the Capitol. Well, back in Gaston, by June, things are getting really heated. And there was a shooting that took place at the Union Hall where the chief of police, Chief Adderholt, was shot. What happened was there was another call out was going to be made at Loray Mill, and they were having a rally at the Union Hall, and a gun went off. So basically, someone was trying to disturb the rally and had shot a gun. The eggs were being thrown, and a little scuffle broke out. And one of the neighbors called the cops, and apparently Chief Adderholt was on duty, and he was going to come up and see what's going on. Well, the picket line went down the road as they were making their way to Loray, and they ran into a group of officers that were most likely members of the Committee of 100. And Vera, who was leading the brigade, leading the picket line, saw the committee, these officers, and many times they'd been shut down and arrested, which was, at this point pretty common. But instead of being arrested, the officers began to beat them up in the streets viciously. And then one of the officers that was there said, "Come on, boys, this is our chance to kill them all." And they jumped into a car and rode up to the Union Hall. At some point in time, Chief Adderholt had arrived due to the call from the neighbor and got in the car with these officers and went up to the Union Hall. When they got there, they began to argue with the guards who were holding guns, and a firefight broke out, and the chief of police was shot and killed. At this point, Marshall, the things just blew up from there. All the Union strikers were attacked, for the most part. Many of them were rounded up and thrown into jail, and it proceeded into a wild summer of dramatic court proceedings, mistrials, and further escalation of violence to the point where gentlemen were being kidnapped and taken up to Concord and beaten and nearly to death. Attempted dynamiting of a stage in Kings Mountain took place. It was just a summer of absolute chaos. Well, caught up in that was Ella. On September the 14th, 1929, she was heading down to another rally where she was going to perform around near Loray Mill. They were going down there to, raise support for the people who had been charged for Chief Adderholt's murder, who was going to, the first trial was a mistrial, but the second was oncoming. So they're still trying to rally support for these folks. Well, as they were coming down for the rally, they did not know that the rally had been canceled due to the threat of violence. So when they arrived, they ran into a blockade of about 30 cars. And this is a picture of the truck they were using, and the strikers were standing in the back, about a dozen of them with Ella. And they were told, the driver was told to turn around and go home or he would be killed. So he turned the truck around and started heading back to Bessemer City. Well, several of the cars from the roadblock began to follow them. And over what was the Bessemer City Bridge, they were crossing over this bridge. One of the cars sped up, got in front of the truck and slammed on his brakes, causing an accident, the truck going off the side of the road. As you can see, the truck's pretty broken up. Many of the people fell out of the back of the truck. Ella was still standing in the back. And many of the cars that were chasing them pulled over and began to fire upon the crowd. Ella was shot in the back. She screamed out, "Oh my God, they gone and shot and killed me, fell over into the arms of her lover, Charlie Shope, and died. This is the house, the Gamble house, which is still standing, where her body was laid to wait for the coroner. And this is a crowd that has appeared around it as they waited. There were threats that her body would be kidnapped, that her children would be kidnapped. Just a really unsettled time. A local funeral director, Fred Sisk, took Ella May's body to his home, which is also his place of business, and ultimately gathered up the children and brought them into the house so they could be protected. The story goes that he sat on the front porch with a loaded shotgun all night to keep any people at bay. This is a fascinating picture, I believe. It's a very rare one because it's the only picture that we have that actually shows African Americans. It's kind of hard to tell, but if you look over towards the chimney of the house, you'll see a little gaggle of folks. You can tell that they're Black. This is the only image that we have that actually shows African Americans and white Americans standing around together in association with the attack. This is a very poignant point because Ella was an organizer, a labor organizer for both white and Black workers. The Bessemer City branch of the union, as far as we know, was the only desegregated union in the area. One of the things that the union had preached, definitely the NTW had preached, was equal pay for equal work. Actually, also met with Black laborers as well as white laborers. This is a radical thought for 1929, and Ella was one of the organizers for this, and was well known to be one of the few people that the African Americans would trust and would associate with in this movement. And this is one of the only pictures that we have that even slightly hints to that transpiring. Ella May's funeral was an interesting affair. A local pastor, Charles Jefferson Black, who was the pastor of Loray Baptist Church, came and facilitated the funeral. He spoke from John 14 and 1 Corinthians and asked for everyone to fear God and pray for peace. There are several other speakers at her funeral. Dewey Martin, who was one of the local organizers, Wes Williams, C.D. Saylors, who was actually one of the gentlemen who had been kidnapped up to Concord and nearly beaten to death. He spoke. And then Kathy Barrett, a friend and fellow striker, sang Mill Mother's Lament at the funeral. In this picture, you can see the surviving children of Ella May standing around the grave of their mother. Now, Ella May's trial. As I mentioned, there were several trials that are taking place in connection to the strike, the Chief Adderholt beating or murder, the gentleman who were kidnapped in Concord's trial, and also Ella May's trial. This is a political cartoon actually connected to the Adderholt trial, but I think it's a great example of the overall plan of the prosecution or the defense in this particular case. They saw this a battle between justice of Gaston County and labor in the American way and against communism, because the NTW was backed by communists, by the Communist Party of America, and also by Communist Russia. And they use this to great advantage to be a major arguing point about why the union is bad and that it needs to be destroyed, as you see, using the sword of justice against the communist monster. Ella's particular trial is fascinating because it kind of falls in line after several of the other ones where they've kind of picked up steam. They know what they're doing at this point and how to fight against any connection to murder or really bring up the whole communist part, or to downgrade those who testify. Because at Ella's trial, or the murder trial, where they had about 14 people that were being charged for manslaughter, murder in the second degree, including one gentleman by the name of Horace Wheelis, who had actually been identified during the trial as the gunman. A gentleman, Crypt Fowler, pointed to him and said, "That's the man who shot Ella May." Another person said, "I saw a person with only 3 fingers kill Ella May," and Horace, who only had 3 fingers, tried to cover up his hand so no one would see it, but of course the judge noticed it. And also one of his alibi was pretty weak because his own neighbor said that he had come to over that Horace Wills' neighbor testified against him, that he was not at home, that when he came home he was drunk that night, and then later on he tried to get her to be his alibi, and she ain't gonna do it. So there was a lot of evidence going about, especially against Horace. But the jury found them not guilty for lack of evidence because they did not believe the people they're testifying were trustworthy. This trial almost didn't even take place. The solicitor Carpenter, who was supposed to bring charges against people for the murder of Ella May, didn't want to do it. It took an act from the governor to make this happen, and the Attorney General of North Carolina came and led the case to try to find some convictions because a murder had taken place, no matter if they didn't like her, and they weren't going to let it, not let it stand. But ultimately, they lost out. There's even a quote where they said during the trial that 92 different witnesses came for the defense. All of them seemed to be coached, and all of them were just workers that had direct connection to the mills that wanted to make sure, no one got convicted. So what happened to the kids? This is a famous picture of the children. You have Clyde. He's over all the far right of the image. The person in the middle kind of looks like a little boy. That's actually Millie. The taller, that's Myrtle, and her lap is Charlotte, and right to her side is Albert. These guys had a hard life. The only one that kind of remotely had what we consider a normal upbringing would be Charlotte. Charlotte was taken in by family members, by Wesley May, Ella's brother, and lived with them and was kind of treated as one of their own children. As for the other 4, they ultimately went to an orphanage and then kind of bounced around through families until they were old enough to take care of themselves. Myrtle, Clyde, and Albert all lived their lives in Gaston County, in the shadow of the mills. They are buried, at least Albert and Myrtle are buried next to their mother. And they're pretty much told their lives that they shouldn't talk about their mama, that she was no good, and that she, there's a level of shame that they had to carry with them throughout their lives, which is it's an interesting thing when you start looking at that information. Oh, I almost forgot the slide. This is a fascinating slide to me. This is of an estate book settling Ella's accounts, which was done by her brother Wesley May. And in it, I don't know if you can really see it real well in this image, it's listed how much her estate was worth. It was worth nothing. And that nothing was going to be divided equally amongst her surviving children, which just breaks my heart. When you're looking at Ella and her legacy, what does it really stand to me? And there's a great quote from Christina Horton, who is the great granddaughter of Ella May, wrote a wonderful book about her great grandmother and about the family. And then she talks about her ability to organize not only white workers but black workers and her neighbors made her a villain in the South. These bold and forward-thinking actions also made her a social justice pioneer. And I think that's a big part of her legacy. I think that the fact that her songs have survived, or bits of them have survived, a big part of her legacy. I think the travesty of her life is part of her legacy. But I also think in a local term, Gaston County has struggled mightily with, recognition of Ella and of her family and of her children who grew their lives here in the area. but of the community that knew the story but didn't tell the story, or the story was covered up. And it's only until recently, since Christina wrote her book, and of course Wiley Cash wrote his book, The Last Ballad, that really has opened up a reckoning to a certain extent for the community to really wrestle more with who Ella May was, and what she really stood for, and kind of looking at taking some pride in her, and knowing that she was looking for a better life for her kids, which basically is all of us. Any of us that have children, we're all looking for a better life for our kids. Her story rings true both then and now. When you read her songs, you can understand, you can sense it, you can feel it, and it's a very powerful thing. And I just, it reminds me of a time when we did a tour where we go out to Ella's gravesite. I think I have a picture of that. There's the cross that's at her gravesite. We go out and we on an anniversary of her assassination, and do a little service in dedication to Ella. We sing Mill Miller's Lament. We share some information, and we usually go and do some tours of some areas that we know that Ella had been. And we did, the last time we did this, we weren't able to do it this past year due to this terrible pandemic. But last time we did it, we had some folks come from other parts of the family that were directly tied to Ella May. And for them to be able to just talk about openly their ancestor and speak of her in a loving way, and be able to say, we were never allowed to talk about her, but everybody did, because one of the statements was, if you start getting uppity against your job and start to argue about your experiences, a common saying here in Gaston County was, no, don't say too much, or they'll do you like they did Ella May. And which means that it lasted along. Her story lasted along, and it wasn't necessarily, it was carrying on what she did, her movement, and what she died for. And now is at last being a situation where I think the community is starting to see her, that her legacy is one of being being proud of someone who, in a moment in time, stood up for something that we now take for granted, and she did it for her kids. So that's it. I'll be happy to answer any questions. So have at it.
All right, thank you, Jason. We do have a few questions here. And I had a question that was kind of about what you were just talking about as far as her legacy. And I believe I remember, I'll put a link in the chat to some information about the exhibit that's at the museum currently, if anybody's interested in coming to visit. But I remember when you guys opened it, you kind of found out how her legacy beyond this area is maybe a little bit stronger than here, where it was so taboo to kind of talk about her. But in other circles, she was more well known.
Yeah, it was one of my favorite stories in connection to that is actually Wiley Cash. He tells the story all the time. He grew up in the area. He was born and raised here in Gaston County, and was going to school. I think it was out in at this particular level of his education. He was in Louisiana, and he was talking to his professor, and his professor asked him, "Well, where are you from?" He said, "I'm from Gastonia, North Carolina." And they said, "Oh, the 1929 Loray Mill strike at Ella May." And Wiley was like, "Yeah." And they went back home, and he's like calling people and looking things up because he'd never heard of it. So, in the area, Loray was known for years as Firestone, the Firestone Mill, and Ella May was just not talked about. So people had to leave to hear the story, and this, it was a constant theme where the Ella May murder and assassination was far more known outside of Gaston County than it was inside Gaston County. But it was also the sense that what we kept on hearing people talk about, this saying we had, that the workers had, that were in the know, that shared the oral traditions of Ella, talking about don't do you like you did Ella, was a constant theme. So it was not known by a lot of people, but those who are most directly connected to her did remember.
Yeah, we had a very similar comment on, I think it was on our event page about a lady who was not from this area, but came and married someone there in Gaston County and had to educate her husband about the Gaston County history. So let's get to some of our questions. Brad asked, what cemetery is her gravesite in?
It is in the Bessemer City Memorial Cemetery, the local cemetery. If you turn in and kind of go turn into the grave and kind of go up, her gravesite is on a hill, on a little knoll, right where the road bends. So it's not hard to find at all.
And he was also asking if there are any other known covers of her song. I'll post a YouTube link here to a version of Pete Seeger singing Mother's Lament, but I'm sure there's probably somewhere folks can find a list of them and see.
Yeah, the Miller's Mother Lament is probably the one that's been sung the most often. I've also heard that there's some of her other tunes have been adapted to other people singing. Seeger is the one that's the most famous. He's really the one that brought it to the forefront when he was singing the strike songs and the folk song movement. So there's a lot of different versions of Miller's Mother's Lament out there. As for other leading artists, that I don't know.
And I just posted a link as well to the museum's website. So we've got, I'm going to go backwards here for our question. So we have a question. Someone mentioned the book Sisters and Rebels, A Struggle for the Soul of America, also has some information about Ella, and that's by Jacqueline Dodd Hall, an oral historian professor at UNC Chapel Hill. And then I think this person answered their own question, they said, but they're asking if there are any plays written about Ella because when they were working in New England, they actually commissioned a play about the girls and women working at the mills there. And this story obviously is very dramatic.
There are at least 2 plays that have been written about Ella. There are at least 30 books that are that at least go over Ella May or have a connection to her. I know there's another some more work that's taking place. I won't go into who's doing what, but there's a lot more still to come out about her. I know of at least 2 plays that were done. And in fact, one of the local schools here did an adaptation of one of those plays recently at their high school.
Okay. I guess that shows the openness, the change in attitude about talking about this. Someone asked about Guy and if you know whether he died of pellagra or general.
Yeah, Pellagra, pellagra.
Yeah.
Allow me to say such words. Yes, that is what's listed on his death certificate. It's what he passed away from, and he is buried in Armstrong Cemetery here in Gastonia.
Okay, and that's like specifically like a vitamin deficiency.
Yeah, it's a
right?
vitamin B13, which is basically protein, lack of protein. It's a very painful death. It causes high skin irritation that that's directly affected by the sun. Just weakness, vomitus, diarrhea. Your body can't hold in liquids at all. It's gruesome. It's very gruesome. Yeah. It's usually, what we take, areas of malnourishment are usually where you find these kind of ailments. Very treatable. All you need is vitamins and a little bit of medicine, and you'll be fine. And it's like I said, it's a very statement piece that here in America in 1929, we had children dying of that.
Yeah, and I think this is maybe where I had heard a bit about it. Daphne mentions that part of the cause was white bread, essentially, some of those nutrients and vitamins being taken out of bread with new processing of things. Someone also asked, which you went into for Ella, this was the case, was it equal pay for equal work? Was the call for that to be women and men, black and white?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. It was, and I think for that was, that's a really radical thing to say.
Yeah.
Equal pay for equal work. That meant women, minorities, what have you. And then it was very much divided. Say if we were working in the mill, me and Kate were working in the mill together. I would get paid $15. She'd get paid $8 for the exact same job, exact same output. It was very much divided between men and women. And then when you add in the element of minorities, it gets even more grotesque. But yes, this was a huge statement that was being made by the union for equality in wages amongst the sexes.
And how much child labor was there still going on around this time?
There was still child labor. There was still, very much children working in the mills. There had been laws that had already been put on the books to kind of help go against child labor by the 1910s, 1913s. Like what at the Loray Mill building, we have a gallery of showing Lewis Hine photographs where he went in the early 1900s and took pictures of children working, many of them in the mills here in Gaston County. But those are that you still have children in the mills, but it's not as prevalent as you see in the early 1900s. But you really don't see it disappear into the Fair Labor Acts that take place in late 1930s, where you really start to out and out not have children at work anymore and have them going to school. This idea of children going to receive a 12 years of education in the history of our country is still relatively new. They were still working up until the 1930s to a certain extent before it was completely shut down.
We have Brad mentioned that maybe there might be something in the Smithsonian Folkways archives, perhaps John Lomax recordings. So that might be an avenue. If you end up looking into that, Brad, let Jason know.
Yeah, please do. That's a great idea.
Alan Lomax, he says. I think that is all the questions we did have. Do you know the names of any of those plays that you mentioned?
Oh goodness, I think one of them is actually called Ella's Song.
Okay.
I think that's one of them. I'd have to, if they want to send me their email contact, I'll be happy to look into that and send them back I'll be able to find.
And let's see, I'll put your email here.
Mm-hmm.
You guys are Gaston County
.gov. Or GastonGov.com. Jason Luker at GastonGov.com. I should know my own. There it is. That's very well put.
Is there a dot?
There is. You got it. Perfect.
We have dots in ours, so.
Right.
All right. Any last questions? Julia says, thank you. Great presentation. Thank you. And this was actually our going to be an in-person event. I think almost exactly this time last year, we had to cancel it because we shut down when everything started shutting down for the pandemic. So I'm glad we got to revisit and still get to hear from you.
It was my pleasure. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
And thank you guys all for joining us too and for sharing some thoughts. Brad mentioned that his he had family that worked at the American Mill, and he also has some pyramid ornaments too. So
Very nice.
All right. Thank you guys. And like I said, this recording will be on YouTube. So we'll share a link to that on our Facebook and pass that on to you guys as well. Thank you guys. We'll have our next presentation in a month or so. That will be Tom Hanchett talking about sorting out Charlotte. So a lot of content probably around the same time period, but over here in Mecklenburg County and talking about how Charlotte went from a very intermixed business, residential, white, black, poor, rich, kind of intermingled area to a much more segregated landscape. So we will be looking at that. You can find information on our Facebook, on our website, and we hope to see you for that as well. All right. Thank you again, Jason, and hope everyone has a great weekend.